It was supposed to be a simple overnight hike through a familiar trail. I'd done it dozens of times during the day, but for some reason, I had never done it at night. So when my buddy Jake suggested we try a night hike for a change of pace, I figured why not. It was a challenge, sure, but I loved the idea of testing my limits. We set off around 8 p.m., planning to hike for about 2 hours before finding a spot to camp. The trail wound through thick woods, mostly pines, with little underbrush. It was a clear night, and the moonlight made the trail easy to follow. As we hiked, we didn't talk much, just enjoyed the quiet, the rhythm of our steps, and the occasional hoot of an owl. About an hour in, we came across an old, abandoned campsite. There were remnants of a fire pit, a few scattered beer cans, and what looked like the tattered remains of a tent. It was eerie, seeing it all just sitting there, as if the people who had been camping had vanished in a hurry. But we shrugged it off. Probably just some kids who left their stuff behind. We kept moving, but after a while I started to feel off. The quiet that had once felt peaceful now felt oppressive. The air seemed thicker, like it was weighing down on us. I didn't say anything to Jake at first, but when I glanced over at him, I could tell he was feeling it too. And then we heard it. A rustling sound not far off the trail. We both stopped, our headlamps sweeping the woods, but we couldn't see anything. "Probably a deer," Jake said, trying to sound nonchalant. But I wasn't so sure. The sound had been too deliberate, too close. We kept walking, but the rustling followed us, always just out of sight. Then, out of nowhere, it stopped. The silence that followed was almost worse. My stomach twisted with a growing sense of dread. We were being followed. I was sure of it. But by who? Or what? We finally found a spot to camp, but neither of us could relax. We built a fire, more for comfort than warmth, and sat there, listening to the night. Every now and then, I thought I heard footsteps, but when I looked, there was nothing. Jake didn't say a word, but I could tell he was just as tense as I was. When it was time to sleep, we both crawled into our tent, but I couldn't shake the feeling that we weren't alone. Every noise outside made my heart race. I barely slept that night, and when I did, my dreams were filled with dark figures moving through the trees. The next morning, we packed up and got out of there as fast as we could. Whatever was out there, watching us, never showed itself. But it didn't need to. The forest had a way of reminding us that we were just visitors in its world. To this day, I haven't gone back to that trail. I've always loved hiking in the forest at night. There's something serene about the woods after dark. The way the trees cast long shadows, how the silence feels deep and unbroken. But after my experience last summer in the Adirondacks, I'm not sure I'll ever go night hiking again. I was hiking with my boyfriend, Dan. We had planned to camp by a lake, nestled deep in the woods, a place we had visited before during the day. This time, we thought we'd hike in during the evening and set up camp under the stars. It sounded romantic, but the forest at night had other plans for us. The first few hours were fine, almost magical. The moon was bright, filtering through the tall pines, and the air was crisp. We had our headlamps on, but kept them low to preserve our night vision. About halfway to the lake, I started to feel uneasy. At first, I couldn't put my finger on it, but it felt like the forest was different, like it was watching us. I shook it off, blaming my overactive imagination. But then Dan stopped. "Do you feel that?" he asked. "Feel what?" I replied, trying to sound calm. "It feels like we're being watched," he said, scanning the trees with his headlamp. His words made my heart race. I had been feeling the same thing but hadn't wanted to say it out loud. We stood there for a moment, listening. The woods were dead silent. No crickets, no wind, just nothing. That's when I saw it. Just a few yards off the trail, something moved between the trees. It was quick, a shadowy figure darting from one pine to the next. "Did you see that?" I whispered, gripping Dan's arm. He nodded, his eyes wide. "Let's keep moving." We started walking again, faster this time. Every few steps, I glanced over my shoulder, convinced that the figure was following us. I caught glimpses of movement in the trees, just enough to keep me on edge, but never clear enough to know what it was. Was it a person? An animal? I couldn't tell. As we neared the lake, the feeling of being watched grew stronger. The figure was still there, always just out of sight, but close enough that I could hear the soft crunch of leaves under its feet. We practically ran the last half-mile to the lake, our gear clinking with each hurried step. When we finally reached the campsite, we threw down our packs and lit a fire as quickly as possible. The light and warmth felt like a protective barrier. We sat by the fire, staring into the darkness, waiting for something, anything, to emerge from the trees. But nothing did. Eventually, exhaustion took over, and we retreated to our tent. I didn't sleep that night. Every snap of a twig, every rustle of leaves had me on edge, my mind racing with thoughts of what was out there. When morning finally came, we packed up and left without a word. As we hiked out, I couldn't shake the feeling that the forest had been watching us the entire time, like we had crossed into someone, or something's, territory. It all started as a simple plan, a night hike in the Blue Ridge Mountains. I've been hiking for years, so when my friend Kyle suggested an overnight hike, I thought it would be no different than the others. Just a couple of hours to a good camping spot, then wake up with the sunrise. But there's something about the forest at night that messes with your senses. Kyle and I set out at around 6 p.m. We were aiming to reach a clearing about 5 miles in by dusk, set up camp, and relax for the night. We had headlamps, food, and gear. It was quiet, with nothing but the sounds of our footsteps and the occasional animal rustling in the underbrush. I felt calm, at peace. By the time the sun dipped below the horizon, we were still a mile from the clearing. The forest was swallowing us in darkness, so we turned on our headlamps. The trail narrowed, and the trees felt like they were closing in. We didn't speak much. I don't know why, but I felt like if I talked, something might hear us. We were about 10 minutes away from the clearing when I started hearing footsteps behind us. At first, I thought it was just an echo, our steps bouncing off the trees, but then I realized the timing was off. They were just a second behind ours, as if someone, or something, was mimicking us. I stopped. Kyle bumped into me. "What's up?" he asked. I didn't say anything at first, just listened. The footsteps stopped too. Kyle laughed nervously. "You're freaking me out, man." But I didn't laugh. "Let's keep moving," I said. We started walking again, but the footsteps resumed, closer this time. My pulse quickened. Every hair on the back of my neck was standing up. I couldn't shake the feeling that we weren't alone. We picked up the pace, practically jogging toward the clearing. The footsteps behind us sped up as well. By the time we reached the open space, we were both panting, drenched in sweat. But the footsteps had stopped. We set up camp quickly, not talking about it, trying to ignore the weirdness. After we'd eaten and settled into our tents, I heard it again, footsteps circling our camp. I nudged Kyle, who was already wide-eyed. "You hear that?" he whispered. I nodded, my heart pounding. Whoever, or whatever, was out there had followed us and was now stalking around perimeter of our camp. We didn't sleep that night. We just sat there, listening to the soft crunch of leaves as something moved around us, never coming closer, never leaving. When the first light of dawn broke, the footsteps finally stopped. We packed up and hiked out of there as fast as we could, not stopping to rest until we reached the car. To this day, I don't know who or what was out there with us, but I know one thing for sure. I'll never hike in the woods at night again.